So an advanced civilization, by definition, has to be a civilization which is not only capable of technological feats, but that is also spiritually very grounded. And it's interesting, in the tradition of the flood of Noah that we find in the Bible, the tradition of Atlantis is passed down to us by Plato. In the Mesopotamian traditions, the Gilgamesh story, the Great Flood, the figure of Oannes, the civilizing hero who emerges from the waters of the flood and teaches mankind the origins of civilization.
Thoth as well.
Thoth, the god of wisdom. You know, these accounts are all around the world.
Because like the label, the thing that gets thrown onto you is metaphysical,
and the issue of what is an advanced civilization.
What isn't it? Yeah.
That's the key issue, and I think we need to broaden our horizons in that respect. I take note of certain anomalies, those ancient maps, the ancient knowledge of precession of the equinoxes, a deep understanding of astronomy that could only be gained through hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years of very careful observation. The phenomena like the description of the Ark of the Covenant that I mentioned at the beginning, and the bolts of fire shooting out of it, the mystery of the construction of the Great Pyramid, which, contrary to archaeological views, has never been solved.
Right.
Nobody knows how it was done. I mean, you are looking at 6 million tons, 13-acre footprint, 481 feet tall, 2.5 million blocks of stone in its construction.
How'd they do it?
Nobody knows how it was done. And anybody I have no clue.
I mean, how could anyone know? Archaeologists propose the idea that they built ramps and wet
ramps
sand.
are the main theory, and then it's and sliding blocks along wet sand, which is fine at ground level, but really difficult to do 300 feet above the sand. You know, and the notion of ramps is problematic because those ramps couldn't have a slope in excess of 10 degrees. And if you're going to get to the top of the Great Pyramid, 480 feet above the ground,
that's a steep,
with a top of 10 degrees, you're looking at a gigantic ramp. It's much bigger than the Great Pyramid itself. And if it's going to support the weight of multi-ton megaliths, then it's got to be really solid. It can't just be an earthen ramp. It's got to be a stone ramp. And where's all that stuff gone?
Yeah,
right.
You know. So then the other archaeologists have tried to propose internal ramps. There's all sorts of proposals and suggestions, but there are no facts on the construction of the Great Pyramid.
I like the theory of acoustic levitation.
I like that theory too. And again, this is one of the areas where archaeologists attack.
They're like, no, what are you talking about?
Because I'm referencing indigenous myths and traditions from ancient Egypt and from many cultures which speak of large megaliths being moved into place with sound. The use of sound,
which is a scientific thing, just not happening on that scale yet.
Yeah, it's happening now on a very small scale. It's possible to use sound to levitate tiny objects. Well, if you can use sound to levitate tiny objects, perhaps you can use it to levitate very large objects as well. Perhaps we're looking at a lost science here.
Well, and
we don't understand.
That's the thing.
And actually, you know, I don't dwell in my work very much on that. I talk of the ancient Egyptian priests chanting blocks into the air because that is an ancient Egyptian tradition. But I don't dwell on it a great deal. But when archaeologists want to attack my work, that's the 1.5 pages in one book
they circle,
that they pick on and say, this is what Hancock's work is all about. Woo-woo ideas about magical levitation of blocks. No, that's not what it's about. I think we're confronted by an enormous mystery with megalithic sites all around the world. And we don't understand them properly. In Peru, at Sacsayhuaman, and Cusco, the Sacred Valley, there are extraordinary megalithic sites there. Sacsayhuaman is the best known of them, with giant megaliths fitted together with incredible precision. These are like jigsaw puzzles, and no single megalith is the same shape as another one, but they're all cut and placed to fit perfectly together so that you can't even get a sheet of paper in between the blocks. And one of my principal informants there at Cusco is Jesus Gamarra, who himself is a descendant of the Incas. He thinks that the Incas found that work already there.
Oh, wow.
And that they overbuilt and built around it. And he speaks of ancient Peruvian traditions, and others do, about some kind of plant which softened rock.
Interesting.
So that they could mold it, almost like
Play-Doh or something, yeah.
And mold it into shape. And then suddenly, if that were the case, many anomalies of those huge megaliths, like the scalloped grooves, almost like somebody's run a butter knife down the side of an edge of butter, or holes in them that don't make any sense. All of those things suddenly begin to make some kind of sense. I'm not saying that's how it was done. I'm saying that we should be open to these extraordinary possibilities and not just write them off as absolute nonsense. And we should respect the indigenous traditions that speak of them.
Right. Well, and that's where you really differ. Is you're not only looking at the physical archaeological evidence that's there, but you're also taking into consideration the indigenous cultures and the. I really like that about your series, is that you then tell the indigenous story on what they believe happened
in every case,
in every single site that you went to. And I thought that
and you talked about the Bimini Road a moment ago. This is not so much about indigenous traditions, but most people don't realize that the tiny island of Bimini was part of a very large landmass, that the Bahama Banks were all above water during the Ice Age, and there was a huge island there. We started the series with Gunung Padang in Indonesia, and there our principal expert is an Indonesian geoscientist called Danny Hillman Natuwajaja. I've known Danny for years, and he's absolutely dedicated and committed to this work, and he's done a huge amount of remote sensing work. When I say remote sensing, I'm not talking woo-woo. I'm talking seismic tomography.
Yeah.
I'm talking getting images of what's deep underground and finding chambers deep under this structure. And Danny is quite confident from his work and from the detailed work that he's done that the origins of this site go back at least 20,000 years. That it's a very, very ancient site. And again, archaeologists find ways to insultingly dismiss him while claiming that they respect indigenous views. They pour scorn on this particular indigenous view, Danny's view, because it doesn't accord with their narrative. What a bunch of hypocrites they are.
Yeah. It makes no sense. I don't understand it at all. I mean, why wouldn't you allow them to be a part of this conversation and take it more seriously?
It beats me.
Maybe they have there's, like you said, shreds of truth. Even if you're not going to take all of it for granted, then there's shreds in there of truth.
It's the bottom line is there are matters that need to be investigated further that are not being investigated further. And the reason they're not being investigated further is not a conspiracy. The reason they're not being investigated further is that the archaeological institution is extremely arrogant in its claim to sole possession of the past. And they'll say, oh, we welcome amateurs. Well, yes, they do, as long as the amateurs say what archaeologists say. Right. Stick to the narrative. The moment you start challenging the narrative, they don't want any amateurs involved at all.
Mm-hmm. And I don't really see them denying that fact either. Not saying like, oh, we welcome alternative points of view or anything like that. It's
far from it.
Because they're just
ultimately what we have there is a very insecure institution.
Yeah.
If it was secure, if it had a really secure footing in the past,
they'd be like, let's take a look.
Yeah, let's take a look. This is at the very least, we don't need to smear and insult and wage a propaganda war against people who are presenting an alternative narrative. At the very least, we don't need to do that because we're so sure of our ground. They can't be sure of their ground if they're so sensitive and so defensive on every single point. They just can't be sure of their ground, and they shouldn't be sure of their ground. The problem is they're not sure of their ground, but they pretend they are.